Go ahead and talk.
All right, well, is there anything on there now?
Well, if there is, we're erasing it while we talk. Whatever we said before is being erased, but that doesn't really make any difference.
Well, as I said, I'd start it once in a while, and then I was afraid that I'd have something over, and then how do you erase it?
Well, no, we're erasing it by talking.
And I guess maybe I can tell you a lot of the history. Years.
Now let's talk some more, just for fun. When did you come here?
All right, my grandparents, Dr. John and Sarah Struble, came here in the early 1900s.
Wow.
And my dad came to this area about the same time to work in the lumbering camps. My mother and dad met and were married on April the 18th in 1905.
Oh, that's not
good. My oldest brother, Edward, was born on February 22nd in 1907, but he only lived just a few hours. My sister Ruth was born in March of 1908, and I was born in Miami, Arizona. My grandfather died 6 days before I was born in 1910. My grandmother died in 1927. My mother died in 1943, and my dad in 55. This is something different for me to talk into a machine like this. If someone were right here to talk with me, I guess I could say a lot more. However, I will do the best I can. As a little girl, I don't remember having anyone to play with except my brother and sister. In the early days, my parents and grandparents had built the house at the lake. And then as time went by, they built the house back at the farm, which is about 1.5 miles away. My first recollection of school is in a one-room schoolhouse with just the 3 of us going to school, more like a private school. My first teacher I well remember was Amber Furry. She lived in the same house with us, and I remember well how she got paid $30 a month together with her board and room. My second teacher was Pearl McNichols from Bay City. She taught for 2 years. Then at the end of 3 years, for some unknown reason, we did not have our private school, as they called it at that time, but we joined with another school in the area with more children. I can't remember how many there was, but the schoolhouse stood on the corner. Oh, I just can't tell you exactly where it was. 1 mile south of where the Baptist church stands right now. And there we went to school for several years. How did we get there? We walked. From the farm, we walked across the marsh and down to the lake, and then followed the dirt road back down to the school. And as I remember, there was only just a few students there. The only names that I can remember was Johnny Rue and Josephine well, I just can't even remember her last name. But it was Frank T-Check's daughter. Frank was a farmer living there alone, and he married Josephine's mother, and she joined us then going to school. We went to school for several years there, and then they decided that the schoolhouse should be moved 1 mile to the north, so it was more centrally located in the middle of the district. Then, as I remember, as each year went by, we had a few extra students. We went to school there until I was through with the 7th and 8th grade. When my sister Ruth went to write on her 8th grade examination into Roscommon, I went with her. And our county school commissioner then, George Kuhn, talked me into writing on the 8th grade examination. At that time, we had to write on separate examination to go from 8th grade into high school. So I wrote on the 8th grade examination, and for some unknown reason, I got a good mark, and I was given my 8th grade diploma at the same time my sister, 2 years older, got hers. And that was in 1923. As time went on, that fall, I went on into Roscommon to go to high school. My 9th grade was spent in the Roscommon High School. How did I get there? At that time, well, that's quite a few years ago. I remember my folks having an old Model T Ford. In fact, I can't remember when they got it, but I know I started driving when I was about 12, 13 years old and got my license when I was 14. Maybe sounds funny, but at that time we could get licenses at that time. I remember my father would take me into Roscommon on either Sunday night or Monday morning and come and get me on Friday afternoon. In the fall and spring, I'd come home every weekend, but in the wintertime, when we had lots of snow, there were a lot of times that I could not get home for weekends. In the early days, the only means of transportation we had was with the horse and buggy, horse and wagon in the summertime, and sleighs in the wintertime. Our activities were somewhat curtailed to what you have today because we didn't go then like we did today. After 1 year in high school in Roscommon, my folks decided it was much easier for me to get to Grayling than Roscommon. So for my 10th grade in school, I transferred to Grayling and went the last 3 years of high school in Grayling. I graduated from the Grayling High School in June of 1927. How well I remember the night of graduation. That same day I had broke out with measles, and I attended the graduation even though I was covered with measles from head to foot. And needless to say, I wasn't very comfortable. My earliest recollection of days spent at home was on the farm. In the summertime, we would walk the mile from the farm down to the lake so we could go swimming and enjoy the beautiful waters of Higgins Lake. In the wintertime, we had lots of snow and plenty of things to find to play with. At that time, we entertained ourselves. It wasn't like the children of today who have to have something going on all the time or they're not happy. As I've said before, I was raised on a farm, and in the summertime, we spent many long hours working in the garden. Strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, then all kinds of garden vegetables. My dad would deliver milk and eggs and vegetables to the resorters who came to spend the summer at their cottages in Higgins Lake. Their livelihood, the money that they had to live on, was the result of vegetables, fruit, eggs, chickens, what have you, that they raised and was sold to the summer resorters. My early recollection of summer resorters was the Slagles, the Bromleys, the Cullens, the Edgars, Mrs. Roth. Oh, I guess I could go on indefinitely naming the early settlers here at the lake. Many of their homes still stand erect, the same as they were when they built them many years ago. Others have been torn down and new modern buildings have been erected in their place. We did not have good roads at the time. In fact, they were trails going through the woods. I can remember my father telling about him driving from the Houghton Lake Forestry to the Higgins Lake Forestry, hauling pine trees. And at that time, he said there was only one farmhouse between Houghton Lake and the Higgins Lake State Nursery. That was Fern Glen, which now is where Birch Lodge is located. It belonged to the D.H. Mathesons. The Matheson family is a name long to be remembered from way back. I can well remember in November of 1919 when the draft call was going on, World War I was in full swing, and my dad had been drafted. How well I can remember the day that my dad was to leave. He had his duffel bag packed and was ready to go. I can't remember how we got the word that the armistice had been signed and that he would not have to report for duty. I can still hear my mother's words, "Thank God my prayers have been answered, and your dad don't have to leave us." In 1920, Lyon Township was set aside from Garrish Township. Our first supervisor was D.H. Matheson from what is now Birch Lodge. At that time it was Fern Glen. George Behrens was our first township clerk. Chris Klinger, our first treasurer. That actually is the only names that I can remember as regular township officers. However, I do know that my father was at one time elected township road commissioner, and it was through he, together with Frank Doonan, who laid out and really built the first roads that were made here in Lyon Township. I've enjoyed reading the book that Jim Cornelia wrote of Roscommon, and many of the things he has told about are very vivid in my mind. He tells about Frank Doonan marrying one of the Cornelias, which was one of his relatives, his aunt, I think, marrying Frank Doonan, and they came to Higgins Lake to live. I can well remember the house that they built and lived in here in what is Lyon Manor subdivision. Many questions are asked of me today which I'm not able to answer. But again, I am the oldest person in Lyon Township today who has lived here continuously all my life. It would make it much easier for me if someone were here to ask questions, and then I would be able to give you the answer. But just for someone to sit here and talk and tell you things, it's rather difficult. After I graduated from high school in 1927, my folks decided that I should continue with my education. In that fall, in September, I entered the Kalamazoo Business College to take up a business course. I was interested in typing, bookkeeping, and the likes of that, which is involved in office work. That, I guess, was my first love. After going to school down there for 9 months, I graduated, and my first job was in Jackson at Sparks Withington. I graduated in June and started working immediately thereafter. It was through the school that I got this job, and there I had a real good job. While going to school and the year that I worked down there, I didn't get home very often. In fact, I think when I went down there in September, I don't think I got home until Christmas time. And then I don't remember coming home at Christmas time, between Christmas and the time I got out of school. In fact, I started to work right then, and I can't remember even then when I came home for the first time. I do remember coming, after working for a year in Jackson, I do remember coming home in August of 1929 for my vacation. I had 2 weeks vacation. Yes, I came home, and while here I met my future husband. Roy Fraser had come to Higgins Lake with Lawrence Bankert and Charlie Fay to build the Spanish War Veterans Shelter, it was called at that time. He had come here in July of 1929. When he first came here, he thought this was the most God-forsaken country that he had ever seen. However, things changed. After I came home and met him, I guess it was love at first sight. I did go back to Jackson and worked just long enough to keep my record straight and gave them my announcement that I was quitting. And I came home. At that time, Roy was foreman in building the Spanish War Veteran Shelter. And when I came home, I was given the job as bookkeeper for that job. And as I said, we fell in love, but we were not married until May of the following year. When Roy came to Higgins Lake, he had his daughter, Zenith, was 5 years old at the time. A lovely little girl who I loved from the time I met her until the day that she died. Roy and I were married in May of 1930. As I've said before, I have lived in this area all my life, 81 years continuously. So needless to say, I have seen many, many changes. We built our first home here on the lake in 1930. That house burned in January of 1937, and we lost everything we had except the clothes we had on our backs. Zenith was in school at the time of the fire. Rita was not old enough to go to school at the time. Roy was out on the lake fishing, and Rita and I had gone out to the corner to pick up the mail when the fire happened. Luckily, no one was in the house, and other than losing everything we had, we were very, very fortunate. We rebuilt our house in the same location that same year, 1937. And again, as I say, I have lived here continuously all this time. As I have said, I have seen many, many changes in this area. Years ago, we did not have little country grocery stores to run to. When my dad would go into town, he had to buy enough groceries which would last us for a couple weeks because they didn't run to the store every day like we do today. I guess the little gas station and grocery store, the first one that I can remember, was Joe Pfeffer. That building still remains right on the blacktop right here, not too far from us. Later on, the Ericksons built the grocery store and gas station out here on the corner, the end of our street. Later on, the Ericksons store was sold to Harold and Nellie Fay. And they operated for many, many years. Later on, Harold Fay sold it to Bob and Rita Fay. And they operated it again for, I believe, 18 years that they were in the grocery store. Since they sold it, it has been changed hands 2 or 3 times. But at the present time, it is operated under the name of Big Mac's Grocery Store. As I said before, Roy came here to Higgins Lake to build the Spanish War Veterans Shelter. And in the meantime, he finished that, and we were married and lived here continuously ever after. Roy was a carpenter, and he built many, many places. I drive around the lake and see many of his landmarks that he has built. I guess the first one he built was for Charlie Fay in 1930, right after the first summer after they had completed the Spanish War Veterans. Roy built Charlie Fay's house, and Charlie lived there until the time of his death. After his death, the place was sold to Tom and Marion Sherman, and they still live here to this day. Needless to say, the little house that Faye's built was just a small shack in comparison with what the Shermans have today, but it still remains a landmark. Lawrence Bankert, a long, long time resident of Higgins Lake, though he has been deceased many, many years, the house that he lived in at the time is still a landmark in Lyon Manor. As I said, I drive around the lake and I can see many of Roy's landmarks still stand as a tribute to his memory. Oh yes, boats too. That was one of his specialties, building rowboats. He could build them right here in the yard, and for years ago, he couldn't build them fast enough. He would make one here at home in the yard, and before he had got it built, it was sold. In 1932, we built the Lyric. It was a dance hall built first. We operated that as a dance hall for a few years. Then it was decided that we needed to have beer to draw as a drawing card. But we could not serve beer in the dance hall, so we built an extra building right side by side. That dance hall and beer garden we operated for possibly 10, 11 years. Then in about 1940, I guess it was, that we sold it, and after it had changed hands a couple times, the building we sold the building in 1941, I think, and after it's changed hands 2 or 3 times and had remodeling done and revamping. The building finally collapsed under the weight of ice and snow in April of 1943. Needless to say, that was a mess for a long time. After it had been sold and changed hands, and through hook or crook, I guess, the bank finally had to take over the building. I said the building, the unsightly mess. And Derb and Louise Zelinsky, Walter and Louise Zelinsky, decided that it would be a beautiful location for a home. They bought the building, and with a lot of hard work and heartaches, they cleaned up the unsightly mess, and they built a beautiful home on this corner lot right at the end of my street. Derb unfortunately passed away about 7 years ago, but his wife Louise still lives in the same house. No one could ever ask for any better neighbors than the Zelinskys have been over a period of years. Louise Zelinsky is a sister to Tony Albasto. I'm sure many of you will remember Tony Albasto, who operated Tony's Little Mighty Store on the west side of Higgins Lake for years and years and years. And Louise worked in that store, put many, many long, hard hours in there, both summer and winter. As I've said before, how much easier this would be if I had someone here to ask questions. I would be able to talk much more freely. The Spanish War Veterans Shelter, which was built in 1929, has operated ever since. It has expanded to great extent over the period of years. As time went on and Spanish War veterans grew older and were not able to maintain the building, it was transferred to the AMVETS, and since then has operated for the AMVETS organization. The building is run very much like a hotel. Veterans, of course, are given preference. People can come in and stay overnight or a week or as long as they want to. It is a lovely place for a vacation, and the prices are reasonable. There are many names who remain as former well-known residents. Paul and Celia Rydell. And of course, John Rue was Paul Rydell's stepson. As I remember, Johnny Rue was one of the first young boys that I ever met. And I thought at one time he was a pretty nice, sharp-looking young fellow. He went on to marry Bernice Rue later on, and John and Bernice Rue built the store that Tony Albasto operated for many, many years. Johnny Rue is long passed away, but his wife, widow, Bernice Rue, still lives. She has one daughter, Mary Kay, who lives in West Branch. Both Mary Kay and her husband are teachers in the West Branch school area. And Bernice has a home up at Torch Lake, I believe, up there in that area, and spends her winters in Florida. The Mathesons are long-time well-known names related to the Matheson's in Roscommon that operated the Herald News for many, many years. George Barron's, who was George and his brother Augie Barron's, had the post office in Lyon Manor for many, many years. As I said, George was our first clerk in Lyon Township. The T-checks, well known. Chris Klinger. Gus Undersack. That name still is to be remembered because they're related to the Frank Caleys, who came here later on and have decided to make their home here. Art Fisher and Ernestine Fisher. At one time they had the Higgins Lake Post Office. And Ernestine Fisher's son, Arthur Wedge, was one of the first students who started the school. Guess I gotta go back a ways now and tell you about when our school started here in 1930. When I finished school in 1923 and we went away to school, Johnny Rue went to the Holton Lake School, and my brother Lee went to the Garish Township School. And at that time he lived with the Johnsons, Walter Johnson parents who lived there, and the Johnson home still stands there as a landmark. I guess it was 1930 that we started in transporting what students there was. I guess Zena was the only one to go to school. In the year she started in 1930, we had to take her over to the Higgins Lake Nursery, which was 2 miles away. We would take her over in the morning and go and get her at night. This we did for, I think, only 1 year. Then the following year, there was a couple more students. Betty Jean Marvin. Her parents were Warner and Charlie Marvin. Warner and Velma Marvin. Then there was Melvin Marvin. His parents were Charlie and Irene. And about that time, they started school in Roscommon. About that time, when we decided we had to transport our children into Roscommon, the school district decided we needed to transport our own children. My dad, Henry Heidemann, drove the school bus for a few years. My brother Lee drove the school bus for a few years. Then I don't remember how come, but I know Lee's wife, Hazel, drove the school bus, because I have a picture of Hazel driving the school bus and taking them on a trip to the up north in the summertime, just before school is out in the early summer. As I said, Roy has got many landmarks around in the area. The Silver Dollar Bar now. He built it many years ago, and as I remember, it was Harold Richards from Bay City is the one who built it and operated it for a few years as a restaurant and beer garden. Then they later sold to the Clancys, Paul and Louise Clancy. They operated it for many years. Louise Clancy was one of the best cooks that ever walked in two shoes. And people still are talking about her delicious dinners. There are none of the old-timers left in this area. I have seen them one by one pass away as years have gone by. My daughter, Rita Fay, has kept at me for years to write, sit down and write many of the things that I have put in this. Since reading Jim Cornelius' book that he had just printed this summer, I have more or less thought that maybe it would be a good thing. Jim has been years in writing the book. He just had it published and was put on the market, and within a couple weeks after the time that his book was put on the market, he passed away very suddenly. This makes you realize that it is later than you think. Just recently, my daughter Rita has learned that after a piece of property has been in the family for 100 years, the government issues you a citation or a plaque or something, and she is real excited about it because, as I said, my grandparents came to Higgins Lake in the early 1900s and bought the property from B.H. Helen. At that time, there were no roads, no streets, no cottages, no nothing. Rita has asked the question many times about different things. Many of those questions I cannot answer. She asked about Strubal's addition. That's a question I can't answer, but I do remember Uncle Will Gallup and my grandmother, Sarah Strubel, were half brother and sister. It is in Strubal's addition that the William and Helen Galinskis have their property today. And that is why Rita asked the question, how come it is Strubal's addition? I guess there's many things that I could learn were I to dig down into history. And perhaps if I decide to write a book, I would learn a lot of things myself today. Higgins Lake at one time was the sixth most beautiful lake in the world, but you sure can't say that today. How times have changed. With the influx of more people, buildings here and there, it's no wonder that our lake is becoming polluted. It is a deep lake, and it is a clear lake, and the water is beautiful. When Zenith was alive, she had traveled a lot during her life, and she always came back to Higgins Lake, the most beautiful lake in the world. No matter where you go, you'll never find a place like Higgins Lake. And even today, my grandchildren will tell you the same thing. Cindy in Alabama and Linda in Connecticut. And both, every year when they come home, there's no place like Higgins Lake. Many years ago, the residents here felt that we should have sewage around Higgins Lake. But it was voted down because people couldn't afford it. But the day is going to come when we are going to have sewage. We realize that more and more as we see our lake becoming polluted. Many of our landmarks have disappeared around Higgins Lake. The Higgins Lake Forestry, the Higgins Lake Nursery, the old Lion Hotel, Kingsley's Hotel, many places on the other side of the lake. I'm more acquainted right here on the west side of the lake. But many of our old landmarks are gone. Oh yes, I forgot about Art Jackson, one of our old timers here. If you remember, he used to be one of our bear hunters. And he, I think, killed more bear than any person that I can ever remember hearing about. There are many things yet could be told, but you just can't think about these things when you're talking here, sitting here by yourself. On many of our maps today, it still shows Heideman's Marsh. There never was a better place to pick huckleberries than in the Heideman Marsh. And I have picked bushels and bushels of huckleberries. That was one of the things that we made our money on in the summertime when I was a little girl. How things change. Years ago, there were no streets, no roads, no nothing. Very few people around here. You could leave a boat on the lake shore from spring until fall, and nobody ever worried about it disappearing. There was a few docks put out in the lake in the spring, and they were used by those who were around here, but not so today. All they think about today is argue, road ends, what have you. How many times have this been in court about closing streets? I can't tell you how many times I have been subpoenaed into court for hearings on road ends. And still I can only say, we live on a beautiful lake. Let us keep it clean and beautiful, and all of us enjoy it. Why argue and fight and squabble over the use of a beautiful lake? Let's keep it that way. When I started school, at first couple years we had a private school in our own backyard. But when we started to go to school, we had to walk 4 miles morning and 4 miles night. Today, children kick if they have to walk a block out to the main road. They want the bus to come to their door and pick them up. Years ago, we did have mail delivery, but as it only came as far as the forestry and headquarters, as I first remember it. And we had to go over there about once a week and pick up our mail. Today we get mail delivered every day almost to our door. Daily papers are delivered daily to our door. People today don't realize how lucky they are. Care about doing. I feel that people are going to say I'm patting myself on the back, or I want to think I'm a big shot or something like that. So I just don't know what to say or how to say it. All my life I have tried to do unto others as I would have them do unto me. My first job was when I was 14 years old. I worked for Hazel Tolan in the Lions Hotel in the summertime to make money for my schooling. I have had to work and work hard all my life. When I was home, of course, that was a different proposition. But when I started high school in 1923, I worked my way through high school, 4 years of high school. In Roscommon, I worked and lived with the awesome family, awesome family, and worked my way through school. When I went to Grayling, I worked the 3 years in high school to work my way through high school. My folks did not have the money, and it was my determination to get a good education, which egged me on to work and earn what I got. It was the same way when I went to college, although my folks did help me and were able to pay my room there. and in college. And I spent 1 year in business college in Kalamazoo. After that, I started working and felt real independent because I had money of my own coming in. When I came home and started working then, I felt that it was my obligation to work. As I said, I met my husband, my future husband, and I took over the bookkeeping for the Spanish War veterans when they were building the shelter. When Roy and I were married in May of 1930, neither one of us had any money or anything, but we started out on a shoestring. We bought 50 feet of lake frontage in 1930 before we were married and built our home. When Zenith, I guess I better back up a little bit. When I married Roy, he had a daughter, 5 years old, Zenith, which I accepted as my own, and until the day she died, she always said I was the only mother that she ever had. Roy and I worked together in whatever we could and enjoyed life together. I worked whenever it was possible, as times were different then than they are today. We worked together and lived together and enjoyed life together. Roy was a builder, contractor, and he worked all his life until the time when he was stricken and was not able to continue working. In 1951, the time came that he was not able to work any longer. I guess I have failed to tell you that I guess I failed to tell you that when I married Roy in May of 1930, I took upon myself a family. Zenith came into our home and she was 5 years old. Then in 1930, Rita was born. Then I went on until 1945 before Jeannie came into our home. When Zenith started school in 1930, and I became active in school activities. From 1930, when Zenith started school, until June of 1981, I had either a daughter or a grandchild in school continuously for 51 years. Zenith graduated from the Roscommon School in 1943. At that time, shortly thereafter, she left Roscommon and went out on her own. Rita married Bob Fay in 1951. Bob was in the Air Force at that time. They were married in July, and in November, Rita joined Bob at his base in the Panama Canal Zone, and there they resided for 3 years. Bob and Rita are the parents of 7 children, 4 girls and 3 boys. And as I said before, all my 3 girls and 7 grandchildren graduated from the Roscommon High School. While I had daughters and grandchildren in school, I took an active part in many of the school activities. But since '81, it's been an entirely different story. When you don't have children of your own in school, you just don't take that much interest, I guess. When Roy and I were married, he had always been active in Veterans Affairs and community activities. When he came to this area, he too took an active part in community affairs. When I was younger, years before, when Lyon Township was first set aside, for many years I took an active part in the affairs of Lyon Township. In fact, I was township clerk for several years, and at that time took part in township board activities, etc. Roy took an active part in veterans and community affairs, was active in the Roscommon County Sportsman's Club, and I held an office in that organization for many years. Roy had joined the VFW in Grayling and took an active part there until 1945. We decided to organize a Veteran of Foreign Wars post in Roscommon. June 10th of 1945, Higgins-Holton post number 4159 was instituted. And in March the 3rd, the following year, the VFW Auxiliary was instituted. Roy was the first commander of this post, and I was the first president of this organization. For 40 years, I took an active part holding the office of either president, secretary, treasurer, or chaplain in that organization, and I worked continuously with post and auxiliary activities. In 1947, the Roscommon Rebecca Lodge 493 was instituted. I was not a charter member, however, I did join the Rebecca's on November the 3rd of 1947 and have remained an active member in that organization ever since. In the early 70s, Merle Harper decided that something should be developed for the senior citizens. He felt that it is getting later than you feel. And at that time, there was very little done for seniors. In the early 70s, the Roscommon County Commission on Aging was organized. And I took an active part in that. I guess I should back up again and say that after Roy died in 1957, I somehow felt that life had to go on, and I dedicated my life to helping others less fortunate than I was. In 1951, when Roy became inactive and not able to continue working, I went to work for F.R. Wyckoff Lumber Company. When I went in there, I went for just a couple weeks. But that couple weeks ended up by being 33 years.
In relationship to how long you've lived here and how much you've done here, how much time have you spent away?
I have spent all my life here continuously, with the exception of the 9 months that I went to school and approximately a year that I worked at Sparks, Withington, and Jackson.
What do you feel are the advantages you've gained from living in a society that's more closely knit than in a large city where you're more anonymous, so to speak?
I'm just happy to think that I have been able to live in the country all my life. From the stories I've heard about city life, I have no desire to go to the big city to live. I'm just grateful that I've lived in the country in the open air and enjoyed freedom and happiness, I guess. You've asked the question how I got interested in writing news for the Roscommon, and Holton Lake Resorter. I really don't know how I got started. Years ago, when there was an article that I felt should be publicized, I would write an article and take it into the Roscommon Herald News for inserting in the paper. And I guess that's how I got started. And that's over 40 years ago. I started in for Roscommon, and then later on, Holton Lake contacted me, I guess, and since then I have just made a carbon copy of news. I love to write news and keep in touch with the public, but there are some weeks that I just can't find any news. I always start in on Sunday evening and Monday morning making phone calls, but some weeks I just can't find any news of any kind to put in the papers. You've asked the questions what our winters are like. Many people say, what do you do with your time? Well, there's always something going on. There's always activities around here in the summertime, or in the wintertime. We get our mail delivered out here, the same in wintertime, the same as summertime. The school buses run. School starts in September, and we have our school buses pick up the kids every day. We have our snow days occasionally, but nothing unusual. Ordinarily, we have our mail delivered out here by noon, 6 days a week. As I said, the snow plows, when we have a storm at night, they're out there. Many times the highwaymen are out working on their plowing the roads, because after all, men and women have to get to work in the wintertime, in the morning, the same as they do in the summer. So the plows are out early. Many times on Sunday morning, or Sunday, they will work after we've had a storm on Saturday. They plow the roads on Sunday so that you can get to work on Monday.
Well, how is that different from 50 years ago?
50 years ago, there was no such a thing as road commissions, I don't think. As I have said before, in the wintertime, or in the wintertime, we used horse and sleighs to get places. That's many, many years ago. But there were times that we were snowbound for a week at a time that we didn't get out years ago. People say, what do you do with your time? There's activities going on. There's things going on in the wintertime, the same as there is in the summer. As so many people say to me, well, what do you do with your time? Well, I thought when I worked for 33 years, I was busy. But I'm busier now than I was when I worked. When you worked, you scheduled your time. So much you had to do in the morning before you went to work, and when you came home at night, so much you had to do at night. But I said, now that your time is your own, you can do what you want to when you want to. But all it takes is a telephone call for me to change my schedule. You ask about snowmobiles. Well, some winters there's a lot of them. Other times, not so many. But ordinarily in the wintertime, especially on weekends, there's an abundance of snowmobiles. They'll come across the lake from north and south, end up right down here at the end of my road, and go wham out here to the Silver Dollar Bar. I spend an hour, 2 or 3 hours out there, and at 2 o'clock, 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, there's a string going down, a line going down from the Silver Dollar Bar out to the lake, and you can hear them going for miles. You can see their lights going across the lake. Snowmobiles in the winter, and jet skis, water skiing in the summertime, boats, pontoons, you name it. We've got it. I may be repeating here because I started to tell about the Commission on Aging was organized in the early 70s when Merle Hopper took an active part in it. Then Margaret came in and we got off on another story. But I started working with the senior citizens in the early 70s. Our first Meals on Wheels were prepared in the VFW hall and delivered. At that time, we were working with just limited income from the Board of Supervisors here in Roscommon County, and we were delivering meals far and wide. I know we had a couple drivers that would deliver meals about 40 miles each trip, each day. The meals were cooked in the VFW hall and delivered out of there. From the VFW hall, we went to the Goodwill Center and operated there with all volunteer help. Then we went out to the elementary school. When we went to the elementary school, the meals were cooked at the high school and brought to us there at the elementary school. Then we went back to the Goodwill Center and cooked our own meals there and delivered meals out of there. For a couple of years, we cooked our meals and had a satellite in St. Helen, and we would take the food from Roscommon in hot containers down to St. Helen. I've worked on that. Then from there, the county, with federal grants, were fortunate in getting 3 centers in Roscommon County. The first center was built at Holton Lake, the second center was built at St. Helen, and the third one was built in Roscommon. And I guess we have been in Roscommon at least 9, probably 8 or 9 years at this time that we have been in our Roscommon Center. The county has been exceptionally good in helping with our programs. In probably the early 80s, we joined with Trio Council out of West Branch. Trio Council is comprised of Roscommon, Ogama, and Iosco counties, and we operate out of the Trio Council on Aging in West Branch. As I said, there are 3 counties. We have 11 centers in the 3 counties. And I have worked with this program since the early 70s. I've been on the Trio Council board in West Branch for several years. We meet once a month, and we have a representative from each county, each board of supervisors, and also from each center. A year ago, our treasurer, who had worked with this Trio Council from its beginning, was taken sick. He was an elderly man, Ira Head, and he was a super old gentleman, had been treasurer since its beginning. But when we had our last meeting in November, he was not well. We did not have a meeting in December. Then we had in January had election of officers, and we knew that he would not be with us too long, but we could not elect a new treasurer knowing that he would feel let out. So he was elected treasurer, and I was elected his assistant, acting treasurer in his absence. On January, he was in the hospital, and between our January and February meeting, Ira had passed away. And in the February meeting, I was elected the treasurer. So that means I go to West Branch every other week to sign checks for the 11 areas. we sign on the average of 125 to 140 checks every 2 weeks. They wonder how can you sign that many checks? But when you figure 11 centers, we have 44 employees in the 11 centers, plus all of their utilities, their phone bill, their garbage container or garbage disposal. In the wintertime, it's snow removal. In the summertime, it's garbage pickup, what have you. And we buy all of the food, pay for all of the food that is used in the 11 centers. If, just like our center, if we run out of milk, bread, this and that, run down to Glenn's Market, pick up this. Well, maybe there's one bill every 2 weeks to pay there. You know, some of them only pay once a month. But people wonder how you can sign that many checks. But I said if anybody would go down with us and sit there for 2 hours and see what happens, they would understand more what it's all about. American Cancer Society. I have worked with the American Cancer Society here in Roscommon County, I dare say 30-some years. I have just about reached the end of my rope. I am getting so discouraged that we can't get more people interested in helping and working on such a worthwhile cause. It's very discouraging when people do not take any more interest in some things. I dare say there is very few families in Roscommon County who haven't been touched by the word of cancer. It seems that it has hit almost every family in some way, somehow, somewhere, sometime in their lives. And yet people are not interested in working with them. It's the same way with the American Red Cross. I know there are families, people, especially our veterans organization, our men who have served their country overseas, who are very upset with the American Red Cross. On the other hand, they do a lot of good. I work only with the Red Cross Bloodmobile Drive. And that is very close to my heart. If people only realized the need of blood and how much good a pint of blood can do. We have a blood drive every 2 or 3 months. We ordinarily plan on usually 5 blood drives during the year. Our quota for Roscommon alone is 55 pints every 2 or 3 months, and it is almost impossible to reach that quota. We post notices on the average of 50 notices. It's put in the Roscommon paper, it's put in the Houghton Lake paper, it's put on the Grayling radio, the Houghton Lake radio, and yet people say, I just don't have the time. I'm afraid. I can't stand the needle. I'm afraid to do it. If people would only realize that 1 hour's time and 1 pint of blood could save 4 lives. I am Red Cross Blood Coordinator for Roscommon counties. We have our Roscommon Center. We have the Roscommon High School. We have the Houghton Lake Community as well as the Houghton Lake Schools. We have the St. Helen Community Center, and we also have the Kirkland College. There are 5 centers here in the county that have blood drives periodically throughout the year. But Roscommon County seldom reach their quota. Why? People just are not interested. They just don't take the time to think about somebody else. Their lives are too self-centered upon themselves and what they want to do themselves. My church affiliation, I guess I can boast about that too. I belonged to the Congregational Church in Roscommon for over 40 years. I try to attend church regular. There are a lot of times I'm not happy with our minister and things going on there. But I'm not one to turn coat and change just because I don't like the minister or I don't like something that's going on in our church. I've weathered the storm and I have held church office, I've been moderator, I've been clerk for years. I have taken an active part in many things. I've worked with the Women's Fellowship. I belong to the Friendly Service Key, which I laugh, they always say that's the old folks' key. But we do have a lot of elderly people. Especially Salome Shepherd. Bless her heart, she's 99 years old, and she said, I'm going to make it until June 11th next year when I'll be 100 years old. If we only had more people like Salome Shepherd, how good a place this would be. I guess the year 1987, the highlight of that year was on November the 9th, 1987. I was honored as one of 150 First Ladies Award that was presented to me by Paula Blanchard, then First Lady of Michigan. It was a day long to be remembered. My two daughters, Rita Faye and Jean Crosby from Traverse City, accompanied me to Lansing, and there my granddaughter, Debbie Pavick, together with Ward and Jackie Kuhn, attended the beautiful celebration. This was really a day which will be remembered as long as I live. I have dictated this at different times with long intervals in between. I can't always remember what I have written. But I think there's a few more things that have come to my mind which are interesting. As I have said before, I was born here at Higgins Lake, within a half a mile of where I have had my home. I've lived in this area continuously all my life. Born here at Higgins Lake, educated in the local schools, graduated from the Grayling High School, met my husband, Roy, and we were married in 1930. And he, too, lived here all of our married life. We built our first house in 1930, and in January of 1937, we had a house fire. Our home was destroyed by fire, and we lost everything that we owned. We rebuilt the same year in 1937. And I have lived in this house continually ever since. Rita and Bob built their home not too far from here, and they too have lived here all of their married life. They now live on the farm that my grandparents bought in the early 1900s. Right now, Rita is real excited over the fact that somebody told her after a piece of property is in a family name for 100 years, a plaque is available. She isn't sure where it comes from or who it's from, but she's real excited, knowing that it only has to go about 9 more years, 9 or 10 years, before it will have been in our family for 100 years. Another thing that strikes me funny, I hear people come up here, perfect strangers, maybe for the first time. I saw a bear. I saw a mother bear and a cub cross the road in front of us. As I have repeated many times, I've lived here all my life. I think I have traveled the main roads and the back roads, day and night, summer and winter, and I have yet to see only one little cub bear in all my life. That's one for the books, I think. As I said before, I've traveled the main roads and the back roads, day and night, summer and winter. I've picked huckleberries and blackberries in the summertime. I've picked arbutus, trailing arbutus in the spring. Roy and I used to hunt rabbits, pheasants, pats, and deer in the wintertime. And still, I have yet to see only one bear in all this time. Another thing I guess maybe I can brag about, I come from a family very much veteran-oriented. My grandfather Struble was a Civil War veteran. My father was a Spanish-American War veteran. My husband also was a Spanish-American War veteran. He was the youngest, he has the distinction of being the youngest Spanish War veteran at that time. He went in the service when he was 14 years old and passed his 15th birthday he spent his 15th birthday in the Philippine Islands fighting for his country. Then I have 2 son-in-laws who have served their time in the war. In the mid-40s, Roy has always been active in Veterans Affairs. And in 1944, I guess, or 45, they decided that it was time that we should have a Veteran of Foreign Wars post here in Roscommon. So Roy, together with several others, Ed Jordy, Jess Green, Charlie Fay, and many others, all banded together and organized the Higgins-Houghton Post, number 4159. That post was instituted on June the 10th of 1945. Roy was their first commander here. After about a year's time, the post decided that they should have an auxiliary. And in March 3rd of 1946, the auxiliary was instituted. And I'm boasting again of being their first president. Since 1946, I have worked continuously in some way throughout that time in the auxiliary. I've dedicated my life to helping others. After Roy died in 1947, different people say, "Why don't you get married? Why do you live alone? You don't need that big house." I'll agree, I don't need this big house, but it's home for me and it's paid for. And I don't have to worry about anything at this time. I'm happy here. I have never found anybody who will fill Roy's shoes. And until that day comes, I have no intention whatsoever of getting married. Since Roy has been gone, I have dedicated my life to helping others less fortunate than I am. I have worked with the seniors, with the elderly, with the handicapped, with the sick, and the indigent families. Just recently, I've taken an active part with the hospice organization, a newly formed organization here in Roscommon County. I enjoy working with them. I have also did volunteer work for the Department of Social Services, taking people to doctors, to hospitals, here and there for treatments. I've driven to Traverse City, to Petoskey, to West Branch, to Bay City, and to Saginaw. I love to do this work. I get my enjoyment out of doing something for somebody else. I see I'm getting pretty close to the end of the reel. I think maybe I would like to start in from the very first and listen to what I have said. I sometimes feel I sound like a broken record. It's I. Please forgive me if I sound that way, because I have not in any way wanted to make you feel I'm bragging or boasting. I just enjoy doing these things. And I guess now I've about reached the end of my rope. It's been interesting, and again, as I say, I think I'll turn it over and start listening to the whole thing and see what I have written. I did back up a little ways, and I made one mistake when I said Roy died in 47. Roy passed away on December 22nd of 1957.